You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
So we're here to talk about restorative justice. And for those of you who don't know a lot about this process, it is a new approach to try to deter future crime by fostering a conversation between a defendant and their victim. And this often includes an apology, an explanation, a lighter sentence, if any sentence at all. Proponents say that this system serves to deter future bad acts by these defendants by encouraging them to take ownership of their actions, apologize, and hear firsthand about the impact their actions have caused. We're going to first speak with Lashana Thompson-L. Lashana is co-chief of violence reduction for DC Office of Attorney General and has personally completed a restorative justice program. Please join us.
Good evening.
Evening.
Before I start, I just want to ask one of the elders in my community, Baba Salim, for permission to speak in honor of the African American tradition.
You have my permission.
Thank you. Baba Salim and Ivy Hilton have been training restorative justice facilitators over the last 2 decades and recently have trained me and my team and helped to prepare us to do the great work that we have been called to do. And I also want to honor some of the other community leaders that I see here in the audience, Tarek, for all the great work that you do, and Olinda Moy for all your work around parole litigation, and former Assistant Chief Grooms. I just want to thank you all for all your leadership and support for communities that have been plagued by violence. 2 of my colleagues just walked in and made me a little less nervous. Seema Gajwani, my former supervisor, and Amin Bill, who is my right hand in the field, in the community, doing restorative justice and violence reduction work. And I just couldn't ask for a better leader, so I'm so excited to be here tonight with them. I want to share a little bit about my personal experience being growing up, born and raised in Washington, D.C., working in restorative justice and violence reduction work. And so my mom came to D.C. in the late 60s, early 70s. She left North Carolina running away from the cotton fields. And she came here where she had me and my 2 younger brothers. And I was born and raised in Southeast D.C., Ward 8, which is basically the same community that it is now. Back then, it was pretty much the same issues that you see, high rates of violence, high rates of homelessness, a lot of returning citizens return to this community, failing schools, failing hospitals, just a very difficult community to grow up in, especially, I think, if you are a Southern person moving and migrating to the area. And so I was raised to learn to defend myself. When I was growing up, I actually used to be afraid of violence. I used to run, and I didn't like fighting. And so I got chastised for it. I was often chastised by my older siblings, and I was chastised by my parents, and then I eventually got chastised by my peers. And so I learned to defend myself in the community that we didn't have a lot of skills in terms of conflict resolution and dealing with interpersonal violence and dealing with state violence and trauma and healing from historical pain. And so I became a very violent individual. By the time I was 19, I landed myself in prison for a violent crime, and I stayed in prison for 18 years. I was released in 2011 after my initial parole hearing. And when I came home, I served in various roles throughout the district government. I worked in reentry, doing work with women in reentry. And I worked doing some work around prison inspections, going back into facilities and checking up on DC residents who are incarcerated in federal facilities throughout the U.S. And eventually I landed myself at the OAG, where I became a restorative justice facilitator. And that was the best thing to ever happen to me. I have gotten the opportunity to not only heal my own trauma, but to help my community heal from trauma. and try to reduce violence in the same community where I grew up. I was recently reassigned as the co-chief of violence reduction, and I'm working really closely with a group of violence interrupters and outreach workers who are trying to prevent gun violence in the community. And in closing, I would just say that through my experience doing as a restorative justice facilitator prior to being reassigned, I thought that I would be so excited about this job because I would be able to identify with the respondents or the defendants or the young people that caused harm. And I thought that it would be a great opportunity to help them to understand how being empathetic and being kind and knowing how to resolve problems is I thought that would be what I would get out of the job, like, being able to pour into people who cause harm. But over time, I realized that the biggest joy for me was the satisfaction that the victims got out of the conference, to be able to see young people take agency over themselves and look at the person that harmed them and ask them, how would you feel if this happened to you? And to see young people be able to address the harm that happened to them without responding with more violence. It's a very difficult job. I applaud my colleagues, Roman Hafer and Amin and everybody on the team, because you would be surprised at how many people are actually intimidated by restorative justice, the people that are harmed and the people that cause the harm, because it's not easy to sit in front of somebody that you cause harm to and actually to verbally state what you did and to hear from them and answer the questions that they may have. A lot of victims want to know, why me? Why did you choose me? What were you thinking? And we have found that the young people that we've encountered are very honest and straightforward. And we believe that it deters violence, it deters crime, and prevents them from repeating the behaviors. And I've had one opportunity to facilitate a conference with a police officer and a respondent. And the young person was arrested basically for incommoding, basically like standing in front of an establishment. And this officer had a really great relationship with this young person prior to the arrest. And she wanted to participate in restorative justice because she wanted to heal that relationship, because she knew that she would continue to interact with him in their community. And they was able to heal their relationship after he was arrested. And eventually he was shot and he survived. And I remember talking to her and seeing how hurt she was by what happened to him, and seeing that even her colleagues were empathetic towards the pain that she felt about this young man. And she was able to support him through his healing process and support his family. So as we listen to the panel, I just want to encourage everybody to think about the different forms of violence. We'll be talking a lot about violence and the response to violence. And for me, there's various forms of violence. There's state violence, there's interpersonal violence, community violence. So when we think about healing pain and healing trauma, I think we should think about healing all forms of violence and not just the interpersonal violence that we see, because it often stems from the community violence and the state violence that we see. Thank you for listening.
Our next speaker is Aaron Rudolph. Aaron is a sergeant with the Washington Metropolitan Police Department who participated in a restorative justice program, but not as a police officer, as a victim. And he participated with his assailant, who caused severe injury while he was serving a warrant, and he is here to share his story and how this impacted his life.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny, not funny, but it's interesting being here as a victim. Before being a police officer, I've been a police officer for about 12 years. Before that, I was a Marine. And if anyone knows any Marines or any members of the military, we're never victims, right? You know, there's time, place, circumstance issues, right? Or, you know, we let our guard down, but we would never refer to ourselves as a victim. So even just admitting that I am a victim, you know, is a process in and of itself. As far as restorative justice goes, you know, I didn't learn about justice at the police academy. I was raised in a Christian home, and the basis for my idea of what justice is and what restoration involves, would be rooted in the Bible. Romans 5 talks about while we were still enemies of God, we were restored to him through his son. And that's sort of been the backbone of my life, as I was raised by a father who loved me unconditionally. I had experiences in the Marines. I was in the infantry, deployed all over the world, deployed to Iraq. I was able to get to know people from that community. I had one special experience there where we captured a terrorist arms dealer, and his son was with him when we captured him. So we took his son into our custody, and we're waiting for his uncle to come and pick him up. We were, able to turn the boy over to his uncle, who was not involved in any of the deals that were happening. And a lot of Marines, viewed him as a terrorist. I mean, that's, his father is one, probably he's one. There's that potential. But I had the kind of unique experience of being able to spend time with him, get to know him. We had an interpreter, which I use sometimes, but the amazing lesson I learned from that experience was even with the language barrier, like love and respect and dignity are a universal language. So I have a picture of him on my phone, and I think back to that experience, kind of how amazing it was that in this situation, I don't know what happened to him afterwards. We turned him over to his uncle, but I just remember him as far as what my idea of winning people's hearts and minds can look like. So coming on the department, I've been on for 12 years. As anyone who served in a large city knows, you arrest a lot of people. You arrest hundreds of people over a 12-year span. I had an interesting experience where I saw a drug transaction happen. I started in Ward 8, in the 7th Police District. Got in a chase with this young man, ended up getting a hold of him. He tried to fight me. I got him in handcuffs. Ended up taking him to the ground, and I hit my knee on the ground. After I got him up, he calmed down. I asked him just respectfully, hey, I wasn't trying to hurt you, but you were selling drugs. I have to place you under arrest. But I'm really sorry. You good? You need any medical services? He said he didn't, and then offhandedly, just kind of joking, because I inherently joke all the time. I said to him, at the same time, it's kind of messed up that you had to run because I hurt my knee when I had to catch you. And just from that short, I didn't expect him to say anything back, maybe make a snide remark, but he turned to me and he goes, "Sir, I didn't mean to hurt you. I apologize," which was amazing to me to see that kind of response in such a short period of time. I didn't know this young man. I'd never seen him before. But in just that short amount of respect that I showed him, he showed that respect back to me. So fast forward to how I got introduced to the Restorative Justice Program. December 17th, 2017, I was serving a warrant on a young man. And went into the house. We had a bunch of people there. House was surrounded. If you know anything about doing the same thing over and over again, even if it's something as potentially volatile as police work, things can get repetitive. And so this was just another warrant to me. Went in, the young man had locked himself in his bedroom, and I was like, "You better open the door, we'll have to open the door for you if you don't open it." He ended up climbing out the window, was acting like he was going to go off the balcony, but then decided, since all my partners were down there, that he wouldn't. So he was coming toward me. I knew his name. I said, "All right, buddy, let's get this over with, call it a day." He held his hands out like he was going to turn himself in. And when I reached out, he grabbed my arm, pulled me over, tripped over a bucket. And before my hands could touch the ground, I took the handle of a bicycle straight into my left eye, which was vicious. I always used to, for anyone who's in law enforcement and has been sprayed with pepper spray hurts. I know, Chief Grooms, I know pepper spray is not the most pleasant experience. And I always used to joke, that's about the worst thing I've ever experienced. But I found out later, the reason my eye hurt so much, I had a double socket fracture. And the tissue of my eye had sunk down into one of the fractures. So I experienced what it meant to go into shock firsthand. It was pretty wretched. I had surgery the next day, had my eye lined in titanium. Again, with my joking nature, about 12 hours later, I turned to the surgeon and I said, Now this means, like, if I were to get like shot in the eye or take anything to the eye, I could probably just block it with the titanium, right? And he looks at me, all serious, because I guess he didn't realize I was joking, heavily drugged up on pain meds. He goes, Officer Rudolph, I hope that's something you never have to experience. I was joking, I'm sorry. I know you take your job very seriously. Thank you for fixing my eye. So that was amusing. Sometime later, that was December 17th. A lot of friends asked me, are you angry? And I was like, honestly, classic police response. I'm like, I'm not angry. He just caught me off guard. I should have never become complacent. It's my fault. And then come Christmas, I don't know if y'all saw my last name. My last name's Rudolph. And one of the requirements of being a Rudolph, I wake my children up on Christmas. I have 4 kids of all ages, and I wake them up, and they're like, all right, Dad, we're coming, calm down. But December 25th, only 8 days later, I got up, but then about 2 hours later, I was just in so much pain that I went back to bed. And looking back, I realized not only was I a victim, which took me a while to accept, but my family were victims, right? My wife was a victim. She didn't have her husband. I couldn't see out of my left eye for about 3 months. I had almost no vision. We take depth perception for granted. One of my coworkers makes fun of me because in the hospital, I was trying to pour some water, and he's like, oh, I got it. I was like, no, I got it. I went to pour it, but the cup was about a foot in front of the pitcher, and I poured it all over the hospital table, all over my lap. And he's like, oh, idiot. Anyway, pride issues, consistent theory. But healing began sometime later. I don't remember how long. The U.S. Attorney's Office contacted me just to ask about, any input I had about the case. We had arrested the young man shortly after he had fled the scene. And I said, honestly, you do what you want with the charges. I just want to meet with him sometime and just let him see the results of his actions. And, it didn't sound unusual to me, but the U.S. attorney's like, this is kind of unusual. I'm not sure what to do with this. I was like, I just want to talk to him. He's like, well, let me get back to you on that. So he called me, I don't know, maybe a week later, and said, there's this, relatively new program called Restorative Justice where you could meet with him, come to an agreement, and they drop his charges, and I'm like, again, I don't care about the charges. You say I can meet with him, I'm in. So that was basically how I got introduced into it. Told my wife, progressed with the program, met Roman, helped introduce me to the program, told me how it would kind of go the first meeting, come to an agreement. And my wife came with me to the meeting. His mother came with him. I wasn't particularly nervous, I don't believe, but my wife was very nervous, right? She didn't know how it was going to go. Was this young man going to be angry still at me for having gotten him locked up? Was he going to be angry at my wife? He started with kind of a prepared remarks, I'm very sorry. I realize the thing I did was bad, kind of thing. And, as I was a little bit skeptical first, like, okay, thanks for saying that. But the more we talked, the more he talked. He just started sharing about his life. I was able to share about my life. One of the things that struck me the most was at one point my wife asked his mother, how many grandkids do you have? And she's like, oh, I think I got 16 or 17. And this young man goes, no, Mom, you have 21. And then he went through his 11 siblings and step-siblings and half-siblings and named and gave the age of all 21 of these kids, which blew my mind. I'm like, this kid loves his family, which is, it was amazing to me, amazing to my wife. We went on from there. We had a good conversation, came to the agreement to meet 12 times over the next year, so once a month for a year. When we left that meeting, it was interesting. My wife said, I could not imagine someone from such opposite circumstances being so very similar to you. Talked a lot, loved his family, joked a lot. My wife always tells me, oh, Aaron's never serious. I'm like, I am serious. I just fill it in with a joke, which this young man did. So it was a joy to get to know him. We met 2 times after that, 2 out of 12. He kind of went off the radar for a while and had some future issues with crime. But at the same time, it's interesting, Roman and I had several conversations about this, kind of, is this a failure? But the joy of the experience was, number one, getting to know this young man. I mean, the 2 times we met, we just had dinner together, shared our lives, shared similar experiences, shared parts that we didn't have similar experiences, and we're just able to get to know each other better, which was my desire for him. And so I hope and pray that his ability to get to know me was at least somehow helpful. But at the same time, I think looking back, and I didn't realize it at the time, but it's just amazing to see the restoration that happened for me and my family, particularly for my wife, right? Prior to meeting him and his mother, my wife had a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, a lot of frustration and confusion. But after going through this process and getting to know him and hearing about the things we talked about, she's like, he's a scared young man. He's a scared young man. And so there's, as we talk about restorative justice tonight, I kind of want to emphasize the 2 sides of it, right? I think a lot of times there's the discussion of what's best for the aggressor, right? What's best for the suspect? Go to jail or restorative justice, which one's better? But I think there's also a huge aspect to consider as it relates to the victim, and how much restoration can be brought just from getting to realize that the person you're dealing with is actually a person worthy of dignity and respect. So thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm gonna be a reporter for one moment, and just ask you a couple of quick follow-ups. One, do you know where he is now?
Yes.
Is he on track? Is he? Was it successful for him, or did he end up back in the criminal justice system?
Yes, back in the criminal justice system.
Okay, so we're going to address some of these issues going forward. How hard was it for you as a law enforcement officer to let go of the charges, to let go of, I need him to go to prison for this?
I have to say relatively easy. I'd been a police officer for a good while at that time. And although that, I think we might all be able to say that there's a role for punishment, right? I have 4 children. And I punish my children because I love them. But at the same time, I punish my children out of love, right? And so, even, and I told Joshua, Roman can attest to this, as awkward as it might have been for him. I was like, Roman, I almost said his name. Wow, I got to stop. Young man, unspecified young man, I love you. And, I do. I love you. And for better or for worse, our lives are intertwined in a small way, and I'm never going to forget you. Just making that known was more important to me than charges. I especially for his age, you can see hope in people, and I still have hope for him in that situation. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Can I sit down now?
Okay, so I'm going to introduce our other panelists. First is Zachary Terwilliger. He is the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. And next is Roman Hayford, who is the Restorative Justice Coordinator for DC's Office of the Attorney General. So thank you both for joining us. And you may hear some differing perspectives, and we wanted people from all aspects of the criminal justice system to be able to weigh in on this process, and hopefully you will get some information that you hadn't heard before, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So save your questions. Don't forget them if you have anything you would like to add to the discussion. I am going to jump ahead to trick our panelists, just because I feel like we're on such a roll with our first 2 speakers, and I wanted to have you guys address this in particular. And Roman, I think you might have something to say about this too. For those of us who've never been in the room for one of these conferences, can you give us a description of the level of emotion that's involved on both sides, from the victim and from the defendant, and the impact that you've seen that have? And Lashana, can we start with you?
Yes, of course. I don't have a mic, but I think everybody can hear me. Restorative justice conferences are always very emotional for both sides obviously, because the person, oftentimes a young person who causes harm, has to come face to face with what they did. And then the person who was harmed is coming face to face with the person that harmed them. Sometimes people, when you harm somebody, they don't want to have to ever look at you again, let alone talk to you in a small, intimate circle. So sometimes it can get very emotional depending on the individuals that you're working with. We spend a lot of time in pre-conferencing, so we get to know the individuals before we bring them together. And we spend time with them, and we get to understand their temperament a little bit. And we actually do a lot of prep work to prepare for the actual conference. So we don't just like grab two people and then put them into a conference. It's a lot of work that goes into preparing them, but everybody's emotional. And sometimes people can get aggressive. That's why the training for restorative justice is very important, in my opinion, because there's different aspects of it. First, you need to know like the ingredients of a conference, how to actually manage the conference, but you also have to do community building and trust building and help people to get comfortable. You have to add mindful moments and address the trauma that could possibly show up in the conference. So yes, it's very emotional, but it can be managed. And it is necessary because even if they don't have the conference, they still have all those emotions. They just stuff them and never really get a chance to bring them out and talk about them with the person that they need to talk about it with.
And for Roman, how often do defendants back out? How often do they change their mind at the last minute? And do they know what they're getting themselves into when they agree to do this?
No. Well, I love that question. You know, it's bringing me back to a story of actually, LaShawn and I had a case with a young man who was like the young man Aaron's talking about, just so confident, you know, to navigate. He's a 16-year-old black man living in Southeast DC. He's slick, he's confident, he's the funniest person I've sat down with in weeks. But when it came time for the conference, where is he, right? You know, oh, I got this, I'm good. You know, oftentimes, it's a victim-centered approach for sure in many regards, and you heard some of that from Aaron. But it is really so often the respondent or the person who's done harm who really is suffering the most going into the conference, believe it or not. Because at that point, then the victim and their supporters are prepped. We know what's going to happen. This is an opportunity. Everybody's waiting for this young person, typically, although we do have adult cases as well, to come in, and everybody knows they have the floor to admit what they've done directly to the person that they've done it to. No ethical walls, no judge mediating. And that is very difficult to do. And I remember that case, we almost had to cancel. We waited an hour, another hour and a half. Finally, he showed up. And I think he showed up because of the R word. There's a couple important words with restorative justice, and it's not restorative. It's relationship. Because this kid, I said, he will be here. Because I have met with him, you know, for the past 4 weeks, probably 4 or 5 times, he will be here. I knew that something in this kid, even though he had not had a lot of accountability in his life, he'd been abused, and he talked about all this in the conference. Another thing I was going to say with your last question about emotions, what I wrote down during your talk, and wow, I mean, I've never actually heard you tell the whole story like that in front of a group. Well done. That was amazing to hear that and be brought back to that experience. Thank you for that. But I wrote down that anger is healing. Anger is healing. If there's no burn, if there's no chance for expression, authentic expression in that safe space, then how healing the conference or the encounter is going to be, I question. Yeah. So what we're trained to do is to manage expectations, get a sense of what emotions, what needs are important to the people involved, and provide a space for those to come out in a way that's actually healthy and healing. And that's an experiment. I'll stop talking because I know you have a lot of questions, but that's an experiment that I think if you ask my supervisor, Seema, we weren't sure if that was going to work. You know, there's so many questions. This is innovation. That I'm a civil rights attorney by training. I understand the adversarial system. I understand protecting clients, protecting victims from the unexpected. But here we are 3 years later. We've done hundreds of cases, and we've started to get into we've learned a lot about what it takes to have healing really made possible.
So our criminal justice system is traditionally punitive, and it includes that level of punishment for a reason, and it has for years. Some people, perhaps one on the panel, might feel that this reduction in sentence or no sentence at all is getting off easy. And, tell me about how you kind of square that in your head, and tell us about the need for punishment and the value you've seen in that. And is there a place for these two to work together?
Sure. So as the, token law enforcement, since Sergeant Rudolph's here in his other capacity.
Just Aaron today.
Okay, just Aaron. Fair enough. First of all, thanks for having me. I love the fact that we can have an open dialogue.
Are we on?
I'll project.
There you go.
I appreciate being here and having the opportunity to talk through these issues. And, I think it's really fitting that we're having this discussion here at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. I'm a big fan of law enforcement, come from a law enforcement family. And obviously, by the way I look and some of the benefits I've had growing up, I don't share a lot of the experiences of some people in this audience and some people we've heard from today. But I do try and empathize, and I try not to project my view of the world on others. So to get to Jody's question, my job, I'm the chief federal law enforcement officer for half of Virginia. It's a law enforcement job. A lot of what I'm doing relates to public safety, and it all comes back to people. So what I care about is making sure the community's safe. And I do think, what I've heard tonight, I've heard some amazing things. I myself am a crime victim. I prosecuted a gang. They threatened my entire family, sent up a hit squad from El Salvador to kill us all. So I think I know a little bit about what it feels like to not be safe in your home, at least for a limited amount of time. I think this is a great concept, and I think it works great in certain instances. However, my biggest thing, and one of the things I worry about, is recidivism. And so I think especially for youth offenders and folks who there still is hope, and perhaps the level of aggression and level of violence hasn't reached to a level where you can have some guardrails. It makes a lot of sense. I've also dealt with what I believe is evil incarnate. I used to be a human trafficking prosecutor, and you want to stare into the face of evil. Look at a 23, 24-year-old who is literally selling another human being. So those individuals, they not only need punishment, but that individual had lost his right to be in society for a significant amount of time. And I can tell you, those victims that I dealt with, it took months and months to get them ready to testify. And some of them did feel empowered by the process. Others felt completely broken. And so I don't think restorative justice can be a one-size-fits-all, and I don't think anyone here is advocating that. I do think there needs to be a deterrent aspect to this. Violence in the city of Washington is, we had a horrible year last year. I know that one of the things that I can do to help that is to choke off the supply of firearms coming from Virginia into the district. And so I think it has to take a whole community approach. And one of the things that Chief Newsham and I have talked a lot about is the escalation of violence, that you'll have a bad weekend. Well, why is it a bad weekend? Because one group shoots at another and then they shoot back. So I love the idea of de-escalation. I love the idea of accountability. At the end of the day, some of the people who are suffering most are those same communities that we've talked about, because you've got innocent individuals trying to raise a family, and you've got individuals who just aren't getting it, and they've been given chance after chance after chance. And frankly, by the time people typically get to me in Virginia, we don't have the same system you have in DC with Superior Court. They've had 4 or 5 runs through the state system. They've had upteen chances, and now there has to be consequences. And I'm not one of those people who thinks you just lock people up and throw away the key. It's not a good use of a human being. I believe very much in rehabilitation, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that there's a place for restorative justice, and where it works, phenomenal. And it obviously provides a lot of healing, but I don't think it can be a one-size-fits-all.
And Roman, if you can just clarify for us, there are some types of cases that is not applicable, right? That you won't enter into restorative justice, right? Like sex crimes or domestic violence or gun cases.
We don't, one of the things that we took from other programs and just from best practices in our own office, we don't do homicides. Some of the most serious cases, sex cases, we don't do restorative justice with typically. There have been a few exceptions to that. Domestic violence cases are another where it's harder to be able to, there's certain things within the dynamic, the power dynamics and things like that. It's harder to trust that everybody will be going into that, freely, consensually and things like that. So that those categories of cases we stay away from. But violence is the thing that we're all worried about, right? And the real mill run violence cases, is what we're dipping into. The assaults, the robberies, the burglaries, sometimes assaults on police officers. That it's that type of violence that's really plaguing our communities, and those are the things that our team is laser focused on, trying to get to the root causes, which a restorative approach helps us do. Restorative approach means it flows from the premise of if we can figure out what caused this in the first place, bring not just these two people, the isolated victim and the isolated offender, but who are the people around them? What do they have to say about this? Who's really needed here? What led to this in the first place? It allows us, it's a technology that allows us to get at those things, and that's why we see studies coming out that show recidivism dropping with this type of approach, because the design, by design, we're getting more to root causes, not just this single offense, these two individuals.
And each of you has touched on this at some point in your prior comments, but is this more effective with juveniles? Is it, I know that your office uses that almost exclusively. I know there are a few instances where it's younger.
Well, our
adults.
office is the exclusive prosecutor of juveniles in DC. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutes the bulk of adult crimes in DC. I would say that, most of my elders, we have restorative justice elders in the room, it's been tested more with juveniles. And
more impressionable, better to change their behavior?
There's a lot of theories that support why it makes sense that it works better with juveniles. I mean, the very theories behind our juvenile justice system are more inclined to rehabilitation, more inclined to sort of trauma-informed care. But that being said, we have piloted and we've had a handful of adult cases as well, and though we're seeing successful outcomes in those cases just as often as we are in juvenile cases. So, restorative justice isn't just something that dropped into juvenile justice reform. That's where we've seen it applied more, but it's a structure for conflict resolution that goes back to the beginning of humanity, in many ways. And so that approach can be used for anything. It can be used in schools. It can be used in families. It can be used with adults. It can be used with juveniles. So I think it's a matter of where we've seen it tested more is in the juvenile context so far.
And Lashana, what do you think it is about restorative justice that changes behavior?
I believe that in order to change behavior, people first of all have to know that they're going to be held accountable. So that means they have to know that they're going to be caught, for lack of a better word, and they have to know that the accountability will be swift, like as soon as possible. So I think that's why restorative justice works, because it allows you to address the harm that's been done quickly and create an opportunity for the person to be accountable for the harm that they caused. I don't believe that every time a person stands in front of a judge that they're actually being accountable for their actions, because they're basically just standing there getting a sentence handed to them and then they serve their time. I don't believe that, me personally, I don't believe that punishment works. I believe that some people can change when they're incarcerated as a result of, personal transformation and taking advantage of some of the resources that are offered to them in prison. But I don't think that it requires punishment for people to change. I think it requires accountability. So that's why it works, because people are being held accountable and they're able to be responsible in a public setting, sort of like a ceremonial form.
And
I hope I answered your question.
Do you mind if I piggyback off of that? Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that Lashana spoke to is the choice, right? Roman and I spoke a lot about this as it related to the young man that I was involved with. This was, the getting arrested for the warrant we were serving and what he did to me was not the first time he had been arrested. But the restorative justice program was the first time that he chose an outcome. In my case, unfortunately, he chose not to complete the entire program. But Roman and I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that he chose it. He signed his name. We chatted for a long time in that first meeting about the best thing, the best way to go about this. And so having that control and that accountability and that understanding that this is something that you're entering into. As a young man, you are choosing this. And so that's why I said earlier, I still have hope for him, right? I mean, both because I truly do love him in one way, but also because even though he didn't complete the program, he chose to participate in it and chose to meet with me a handful of times. And so in a sense, completed part of it, was able to kind of take that personal initiative. So I think that there's great value in giving people, even in a situation like that, a certain level of empowerment over their situation, that they have some input into the outcome.
This one's for the U.S. Attorney. The current system thinks of crimes as crimes against the state, right? Crimes against the government. And do you see room for an additional victim focus in what you do? Would you like to see more? I know you have victims advocates and prosecutors' offices do that. Do you feel like there's room to expand victim services in the current criminal justice system, maybe to include or incorporate some sort of component like this?
Sure, yeah. I think for us, when I walk into court, it's Zach Terwilliger on behalf of the United States. What that means is on behalf of the crime victims of the United States, on behalf of the victims. So I think that's one of those where I think the premise of the question assumes that, I'm just here standing in as the big bad government. No, what we're doing is advocating for the voiceless crime victims, advocating for the people who are, growing up in these neighborhoods. As you described, a lot of times crime is the reason the neighborhoods are so bad and business won't be there or hospitals bad, or if you have someone who's drug dealing in a school and it's causing problems. And so, no, I think victims are a huge part of our process. There's something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act that gives individuals a certain level of consultation requirement. So I think it depends on the crime. Some of the most upset people I've ever seen wasn't the gang cases I used to try. The gangbangers just wanted to settle it in street justice. The victims didn't want to be there. It was the people who lost teachers, who lost their entire life savings in a Ponzi scheme. Individuals who were, elder fraud, folks who had saved and saved and saved, grandmothers, grandfathers, only to be swindled, by some sort of scam. So I approach the job, and I think many prosecutors approach the job with the victims in mind. I don't come in thinking, I'm wearing the, seal of the Department of Justice. No, I'm thinking about the victims in my case. And when you look at sentencings, it's about both the defendant, but there's a huge part of it that's about the victims. We have victim impact statements. We have victim advocates. So I actually think I can only talk about the federal system because that's what I know about. And prior to this job, I was a line attorney for 9 years. So now I push paper, but I used to do real work. That they, it really is a victim-centered approach. I know we have some law enforcement officers here. We have former assistant director of the FBI, and I think anyone who has a gun and a badge or is involved in law enforcement, we do it for the victims. The few bad apples out there that do it for the rush or the power, and we've seen some of them, and I'll be the first to throw bad law enforcement under the bus. But I think for the most part, our criminal justice system, the people I work with and the people I know, nobody is high-fiving because we sent somebody to jail for life. That's a tragedy. So.
The people who go into this program, the victims who agree to meet their offender face-to-face, what are the kinds of questions that they routinely ask? I assume they ask, why'd you pick me as a victim? Or, what if I'd fought back? What would have happened? What would you have done?
Sure. Yeah.
Talk to me about the need for victims to be able to be heard and get answers, and whether you see that, the value you see in that in this system, and whether you think more of that needs to be incorporated into the current criminal justice system.
Well, I assume by this system you mean a restorative justice conference. Yeah, we had a couple of cases come to mind with this. Amin had a case where there was I remember that case with this older gentleman. This was a stranger case, and by stranger case we mean the person who did harm and the victim did not know each other beforehand. And you do see those questions come up a lot. The first thing we ask victims is, what do you need? And sometimes it is along those lines. Why do they choose me? I feel more nervous walking around town right now. I want to know, what is it about what I'm doing that's making me a target? Nothing's really going to answer that question except to hear it from the person who harmed you. And I remember we had a conference with Amin, who's in the audience, and this guy wanted to know that, what is it? Because he'd been a victim before. So there's this sort of he had been, assaulted previously in his life. And so he had all these stories about why, that he shared with us in prep. Is it this? Is it because I'm short and I'm dorky? What is it? And he got into this conference with this other kid, and I don't remember what the reason was, but it was nothing that he thought. And I remember it kind of stumped him. He had all these notes. He was just sort of listening to this kid. He's okay. They ended up, the agreement in that case, they ended up going to clean up a park together. So it was kind of a community service thing, but they ended up doing it together. He wanted to do it with the young man. So that's an example of that. Then there was another case with this is a acquaintance case, or where the two young people who were in the conference knew each other. And this was kind of more of a bullying situation. 9th grader, 10th grader, 10th grader sucker punches 9th grader. His friends catch it on video and this is a boarding school, so in the dorm room. So it's super humiliating. This video was so hard to watch. It's every parent's nightmare, And the kid, the young person, we'll call him Richard. He's got glasses. He's obviously a little bit goofier, a little more awkward. He's younger, and he was holding this this ball. I remember this video, this big ball. They'd all been out on a field trip together. He's holding this thing, and it's this is his security blanket. So it's really sad video to see. And so as a team, we talk about our goals before the conference, and that comes directly from what comes out from the victims. Because victims, a lot of times, there's a lot of things going on. As facilitators, we're trained to listen to some of the things they say and say, this sounds like a need that they really could get in a conference, because most of them haven't been in a conference before. So with this young man, it was very clear that I want him to feel re-empowered, get his power back directly with this person who bullied him, right? And so that means him talking. That means I want to ask questions in this conference that's going to get this young man talking. So we get to the conference, and he starts asking, he starts interrogating the person who hit him, because he asked, why did you do it? And he didn't like the story that the assailant gave. And he said, well, that can't be true because of this, that, and the other. I'm seeing this 9th grader become a cross-examiner, frankly, right in the middle of this conference. And it was just so cool because you see with each question that he came up with, each answer he got, his confidence is growing, right? Mm-hmm. His parents are just sitting there kind of beaming, they'd been nervous about it too. So, that sort of exchange, I think, is harder to get in the traditional, even with victim statements and stuff. It's just a different theater, right? Court is a certain theater, and a restorative justice conference is a different theater. It allows for different sorts of things.
Aaron, do you as an officer feel like this type of conversation fits with the community policing type of changes that have been made in recent years in policing? When you're out on the street talking to people versus, searching people or arresting people, or, is there a place for this together with traditional crime fighting in your view?
Yeah, I mean, for
in
sure.
day to day,
right?
not just in your situation.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that key phrase, right? Community policing. That is the word of the day. But at the same time, that has been for good police officers, right? I mean, like Zach said, right? There are bad police officers. But for good police officers have been doing community policing their entire careers.
They just call that policing.
They just call it policing, right? You build relationships. You get to know the neighborhoods. I remember when I first came on the department, I was working in the 7th District, and there's this idea amongst young officers that if you get put on a footbeat, that is to say on foot as opposed to in a police car, that's somehow bad. You're like, oh, I'd rather be in a car responding to calls and dealing with everything, however one would verbalize it. And I was put on a footbeat for several summers in a row in the 7th District, in the 8th Ward. And at first, right, you're like, oh man, this is gonna be like I have to stay in the same neighborhood my entire shift. That's crazy. And then you start talking to people, and as you might be able to tell a little bit, I love talking to people. I'll talk to anybody. Both people who are being kind and people who are being rude. I'm just like, oh, well, tell me about why you called me that expletive, and they'll be like, what? You're crazy. So I'm sure there's probably a lot of people that think I'm crazy. But the community policing, right, is a part of restoration, right? It's the first step of restoration to a community at large, because you're showing a group of people, a larger group of people, that you care, even in some small measure, that you care about them as people, that you care about their community, that you just care to be there, right? You're not upset, you're not angry to be there, you're happy to be there. And I mean, if anyone knows DC, I spent an entire summer at the, right by the Wingates, this huge apartment complex. There's another street, Joliet. I spent an entire summer there, half the time by myself on evenings, and got to know everybody. And I'd like to think that there was a crime reduction, although at that point in my career, I didn't really keep track of the stats. But I'd go, and people were respectful, and people would greet me, and people knew my name, and there were a group of people that have cookouts on Thursdays and Fridays, and they'd provide me a burger. And I'd like to think that just being a friend or at least an acquaintance to these people, to this community, gave some level of restoration in the process. So yes, definitely community policing is in and of itself a form of restorative justice. Yes.
Lashana, a lot of people get out of prison after committing crimes or go through a process and go back to a life of crime. Talk to me about the decision not to do that and how hard it is when you're coming out and starting over. It's easier to just go back to crime. Talk to me about the decision making to say, no, I'm going to put my life on the right path, and how hard that is, and how a process like this might make that easier.
That's a loaded question, because obviously every situation is different, right? So everybody comes home with a different mindset because people are different. And I think that reentry is a little bit more complicated than people think, because there's various aspects of it, right? There's community support, some civic engagement, family reunification, learning to create a new lifestyle. It depends on like the level of your criminal lifestyle prior to incarceration, because some people are actually in prison because like they made one bad decision. They didn't live a criminal lifestyle prior to incarceration. And then you have other people like myself who I was deeply immersed in a life of crime because of the community that I was raised in and everything that I was involved in. So the transformation process is different for everybody. For me, when I came home, I was embraced by my community and supported by my community. And I had access to opportunity, not just programs or services, but like real opportunities. So that's how I believe I have been successful, because of my village, right? People decided to invest in me despite the choices that I made at a very young age. And they understood that, like, okay, I served my time. I did everything I could to transform my life when I was in prison, so they wanted to support me. And so that's how I believe I have been successful. And that's part of the story for most returning citizens in DC, especially those of us who have served lengthy sentences. I think we're different and unique in terms of like other cities and states. It's not as easy because the community may not necessarily support you or embrace you when you come home. So the choice to not commit crime could depend on your level of skills when you come home, your mental health, whether or not you've recovered from substance abuse. It could depend on a number of things and what support you have when you come home, because you could either be isolated and not be able to vote, or not be able to get food stamps, and not be able to get housing and jobs and education. Of course you might commit another crime, because all of the doors are slamming in your face and you already have a criminal background, you can't even get housing. So every situation is different, but it takes a range of support, from family, community, and individual choices.
How hard is it to look a victim in the eye and say, I'm sorry I did this to you, and tell me how it's impacted you?
Again, that depends on the person. For me,
For you, it
will be easy because of the level of healing that I've been able to do in my life. Like, I've been able to participate in an inpatient trauma program. That was pretty heavy for me. I've been able to participate in restorative justice. I've been able to achieve my undergraduate degree. I work in a healing space. Thank you. So, for me, it would be easy because I've come a long way. But for the average person, I think it's doable. They would need obviously the prep, the support, and the restorative justice facilitators to create that process. But also, we need to create those systems. Because for one, if you are an offender, even if you want to have that conversation with the person that you harm, how do you do it? You don't just look somebody up in the phone book and call them and say, I harmed you and I would like to talk to you and apologize. We need systems in place to support the offenders and the people who are harmed, just in case they may want to do that. And we don't have that right now. But for me, I think it would be easy and it would be an honor and a blessing to have that opportunity. Who would help prepare the victim or the victim's family for that process would be a whole nother conversation.
Zach, do you see a place for that as people are coming out of your system?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I've heard a lot of people say is reentry starts on the first day you set foot in prison, and I think we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, look, who would have thought that we would have had the First Step Act, the largest, greatest criminal justice reform bill. I mean, that's one of the signature achievements of this Congress and this administration, frankly. And one of the areas where I think we really can do better is what I call reentry, when you're coming back into society. And I think LaShawna identified some really big barriers. I mean, housing and food and basic necessities and those sorts of things. So, yeah, I think that's a big, big part of it. Many people who come in the federal system are what's called supervised release. It's sort of like a heightened probation. It's basically an agreement with the judge, she or he personally, that you're going to fly the straight and narrow. And if you mess up and you get violated, you go back before that same judge that sentenced you. And it's that level of accountability. And one of the things that we're talking about doing now are these programs where we, the prosecutors, or it could be a facilitator, or perhaps even a community member that says, look, you've got another chance at this. I don't want to see you in my courtroom again. I can tell you one of the things that makes me the most depressed is when you see these people that just can't get out of the cycle despite umpteenth chances. So yeah, I think there's an absolute place for that, and I think it's important. And I think one of the things that I think is really neat, and I actually was born in the district, if you can believe that, but I was born in D.C. And I think it's neat because you do have a village, and it's a small enough city, and it's a small enough community, and frankly, the parts of it that are hurting so badly, I feel like are getting more and more bifurcated from some of the other sectors of the city. You can have a program like this through the Office of the Attorney General, and that's tremendous. I mean, that's such a gift. And you've got people on MPD like Aaron who think this way. I mean, it's a truly amazing. I mean, there's so much grace that flows out of this individual that it can make a difference, and it's a small enough microcosm. So I think that I think if I am a firm believer that if you can change one life, then it's worth it. It's worth a program. I think the problem, or not the problem, but the cynic in me says, yeah, well, what about where restorative justice doesn't work? Or what about where this individual had this opportunity and then goes and harms someone else? Imagine if that was your daughter, that was your son, that was your cousin, that was nephew, that was your mother, that was your grandmother. I spend a lot of time with crime victims. I spend a lot of time with the so-called angel moms, those individuals who were lost loved ones, in most cases, death, because someone was illegally in the country, committed another crime. And so I think the one thing that you got to couch this with is what happens for the one that you gave an opportunity to. They not only didn't take advantage of the opportunity, but they reoffended in a way and really harmed someone else. And that's something I struggle with.
Roman, do you struggle with that? Is that, I mean, you guys have had some success numbers wise, but there are people, as we've heard in Aaron's case, who go back to a life of crime. Is that a struggle for you as a member of this system to know that you gave someone that chance to let them off without a tougher sentence, and then they go and harm someone else? How do you square that internally?
Well, our prosecutors have, I don't want to speak for them in our office, but the young man that was in a conference with Aaron was really a tough case. Really had social factors are the worst, is extreme poverty. Yeah. We are working with some of the really highest risk youth and young people, and our prosecutors are asking us to work with them because, like you said, attorney, I don't want to call you Zach.
Zach is fine.
I'll call you Zach.
We're in the nest.
The things that's giving you heartburn and worry is the things that's giving us all worry. And like our program wouldn't gain traction with prosecutors in our office if we didn't have the same, we weren't all trained on that same worry. So, when we have a kid like that who's so high risk, we recognize that sometimes that they are gonna reoffend, but we are seeing now that on the whole, when we restorative justice can be a way where direct accountability, it's not removing consequences, it's just consequences that flow, that kind of, I think the idea is they hit home more because they're coming, or they can hit home more for these young people because it's coming directly from someone they harmed, that they're less likely, it builds empathy, right? And even in your case, I think, you felt, maybe it doesn't show on paper, but yeah, you felt that empathy was built. You felt there was a connection made. So yeah, I think we're all worried about the same thing, and I really encourage. I didn't necessarily think I would necessarily work in government again, but it was exciting to get to be part of something that's really innovating. I think, how many of us are tired of this conversation, right? In this room, we're tired of Ward 8 being the same way it was 20 years ago. So, kudos to our Attorney General, kudos to your office for trying new things. We have to try new things and dig deeper, and that's why when I see us repurposing conference rooms in the Attorney General's office to be restorative justice circles, I'm like, that's something different, and whether it's, of course, like I'm biased, like I get paid to do this now, right? But like, to be honest, ask my team,
you don't
they know
get paid
me.
That much, though.
Yeah. I could be getting paid a lot more. Yeah, a lot of my law school classmates are making a lot more money than me. That's true.
Oh yeah.
But what really lights me up is like seeing new things work, trying new things, seeing it working, and seeing support from people who you might not necessarily expect, like police officers. When I came here, I got my start in restorative justice on the West Coast, and this is something that's building. We're trying new things. The idea of involving police officers, frankly, in restorative processes is controversial. There are people that will see me up here from the restorative justice community and be a little side-eyed about that because there is a lot of distrust. But restorative justice at root, I think, is about treating people not just in their role, but as full human beings. And that is part of the real medicine, the real magic of this. And I think you can see that, you can just feel that. So I love being able to give people who've been harmed or whoever the opportunity to play with that, to do that, to practice that. And I think it ripples out. And it's still very early on. We'll see.
Well, and I can tell you in 20 plus years of reporting and covering crime in particular, I know that I've seen the same people get arrested over and over again. Someone gets arrested, you look in the file footage and, oh, look, you've got 3 or 4 other prior cases. I know you've seen it at MPD. I know you've seen it in prosecuting, and you've probably seen it in your program. So, I think anything that breaks that cycle, right? If your recidivism rate is half, you're taking half of those people out of the criminal justice system, so you might not have to see them in a few years, right? So, I think there's new and different sometimes works, and so I think that's. You go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing, listening to Zach, Zach and Roman talk. Zach mentioned the individual, right? If we can help one person. And I think I can speak with some level of confidence that law enforcement is done on an individual basis, right? If you try to look at all crime in the city, all crime in the country, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And so you look at your individual case and individual people. The other thing I'd say, as far as, some of, Zach's possible concerns about restorative justice, right? We can't just do it all the time. And there's truth to that. And I would give Roman kudos on this one. Even in my particular case, I don't know if you remember this, but Roman had some apprehensions. He's like, well, it's cool that you want to do this, but are you sure? Like, this young man got charged with a felony, and we were going to potentially be dropping a felony. And I'm a police officer, and Roman didn't know me beforehand and was like, very conscientious of how it could possibly go wrong. And so I think even Roman, I think this team, the Restorative Justice Program in DC, takes it very seriously, whether or not the participants, both the victim and the aggressor, would be successful. Because if they're pretty confident it wouldn't be, I don't think that they would charge ahead, right? Because in one sense, especially as you think about, Zach keeps referring to the victim. As you think about the victim, if it's a low probability of success, participating in the program would actually be more harmful to the victim than helpful, right? If my wife and I went into that conference and the young man started cursing out my wife, probably would not have been helpful. And so Roman's assessment of both myself, but also of the young man in question, enabled a substantial amount of healing for my wife. I think in one sense, law enforcement officers get used to chaos, right? We sort of always step into chaos. And I can speak for myself anyway, I often forget about how it might affect my wife. We're talking about physical healing, my eye healed, but sometimes emotional healing gets forgotten. And I think that's been improving, in the law enforcement community in general, in the military, right? PTSD is this new thing. Nobody used to talk about that. And so there's a substantial amount of emotional healing that has the potential to happen, right? So the young man in my case got rearrested as an adult. And it's unfortunate, but I pray that it helped him, but I know that it helped my wife, which is a huge deal. We live in the city, and I want my wife to feel safe and feel comfortable with me going to work every day.
So I could talk to these folks all night. I know you probably have some questions as well. So do you want to have someone go around with the microphone? Okay. Do you guys want to kind of make your way out to the sides, or do you want me to call on people and just repeat the questions? If you shout it out, if I can.
No, that's fine. My name's David. Just first of all, thank you to all of you. This is a really excellent topic. 7 months ago, I left CSOSA in DC as a PO. I think most people probably know DC Probation and Parole Agency. And I have got to tell you, I wish this had been a resource during the years that I was there. We talked about that there are bad police officers. There are also bad probation officers. The majority, though, really do their job well. They get to know their client, and a lot of times there's a victim component to it, and we were required to build a relationship with the victim as well. Yes, to ensure stay-away orders would be met and a number of other things. But I also have to say, by getting to know both parties, there were a number of situations I had where I knew both the client and the victim were in a place where they were ready if something like that had been available. So in your program, or Zach as an attorney, prosecutor I should say, are there ever situations where you're reaching out to probation and parole departments to offer this resource? Because there's a huge opportunity that's being missed there. And by the way, one last thing I'll say is, I'm not just talking about clients who are ready for this, who have lower level crimes. I had a guy who actually was on supervised release, formerly known as parole, because in 1980, he shot across the street at a rival gang member and hit a passing lawyer in the car. His main thing he was stuck on, for lack of a better phrase, was that life he had taken. And now obviously he couldn't talk to the man that was deceased, but he thought about the man's family a lot, who we had contact with. So if you can talk a little bit about how you are thinking about reaching out to probation and parole departments, and if you are at all, and If you're not, I would encourage you to do so.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I know it's directed to them, but it just so happens that we have had an opportunity to do some training with CSOSA recently, and that it looks like that they're coming on board, and we have another opportunity coming sometime in the near future. So to ease some of your concerns, it looks like that CSOSA is moving in that direction.
Thanks for sharing.
Excuse me, and they actually have, they actually have a restorative justice unit now. CSOSA does.
You guys you want to weigh
No,
in?
they kind of answered it for me. I was going to say, I've met now, there's now 3, I think, or no, 2 or 3 restorative justice coordinators that CSOSA has brought on just within the last year. And they're part of our interagency restorative justice council that we kind of meet as a village. And we're all, we're all, that's the conversation we're having. Like, how can we continue to innovate, not just in our piece of the justice, loop, but everywhere in the justice system, and provide these opportunities. Like I said, it's not just a program that restorative justice is not a program that just lives in our office, right? It's a way to approach, how can we meet needs, right? And victims can show up, and sometimes they might be ready right at the stage of arrest, and sometimes they might not be ready until years later. But if we have a culture citywide where this is expected, just imagine the transformation, right? So thank you to our trainers in the audience for doing that work. I've been in a lot of restorative justice trainings, but Baba Salim and Mama Ivy's is the best. So.
Yes, you sort of touched on my question, but I'd like to ask it in more detail. Can you say what percentage, roughly, how it breaks down in terms of the 2 people involved, the perpetrator and the victim, having a prior relationship as opposed to 2 strangers? How does that?
I don't have those statistics offhand. We could get those statistics, but anecdotally, it's really about 50-50. We have, a lot of our digestive cases, metro robberies, which are typically stranger cases. But then a lot of our diet is, assaults, serious assaults, in the neighborhood, right? Maybe arising from something that's going on in school or inter-family disputes even. So it's really about 50-50, I would say, as a rough estimate.
Questions? Sir?
As a police officer, I've been to many robberies, and sometimes I start feeling emotional for the victim, and I have to kind of compose myself, and I think I wish the suspect could see what they did and talk it through. What are the repercussions if someone doesn't follow the program? Like, I know you said he only went to 2 of the 12. Were there repercussions that you chose not to do, or is it once they meet, it's not?
He got charged with a felony.
After he did.
Yeah, I mean, so the agreement in our particular case was 12 meetings, all charges dropped, not 12 meetings, you will receive the charges. Yeah, so I mean, in my case, it was pretty clear. I know that other cases are different.
The way our program's set up, restorative justice in this context, we find works well when there's an incentive and when there's consequences, because you can't, even if you're a parent disciplining your 2 children, if there's some sort of consequence. And so for our program, if the agreement's not met, like in this case, we refer it back to the prosecutor. So it would kind of go back to traditional prosecution. That's also good because for expectation setting, if you're a victim who's never heard of this and is like, I'm not really sure if I want to do this, they know that they still have the traditional way forward if they choose. And really that they have to consent every step of the way. Now I will say that of over 100 conferences just in the last 2 years, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that only 8 were unsuccessful in that way and needed to be referred back. Whether it was through, like in Aaron's case, when the agreement wasn't ultimately met, or the conference broke down for some other reason, like people decided, no, I'm not going to go through with this. So again, there's so much that happens in the prep that typically by the time we get to the conference, not only does it work, but the agreement that the people come up with is an agreement that's designed to succeed and that they're all happy with it. It's a consensus agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, I would love to know if you've heard from him since he's been in prison. I want to know if he's sitting there thinking he let you down in some way, since you took an interest in building that rapport.
No, I'd love to. His recidivist arrest was pretty serious, so he's
So no contact.
not in contact right now. I mean, and I think Roman could probably attest to this. I'd love to follow up with him as soon as humanly possible, but as Zach knows, not all cases are easily followed up on.
Gotcha. There was someone in the front.
Right.
Thank you. How actively and routinely are you working with services and programs that can help address some of the contributing factors that led people to make these decisions, such as workforce development, trauma counseling, maybe ALD or education?
Can you repeat the question for Becky?
Yeah, the question was how often they're working with services and programs in the community that have led to these situations.
Yeah. So we have we want to make sure that every person that comes through our doors has those services. No, our program does not operate in a vacuum. Our office has also won awards, including citywide sort of awards for the sort of omnibus service provision that's happening. We have a great sort of pre-existing diversion program called the ACE program that provides the mentoring, the trauma therapy, the family group therapy, these sorts of things that we are now working with them to try to make sure that every youth that's going through restorative justice, we can partner with those outside referrals and get them those things when they come up as this is what's needed. So it's definitely something we think about. There's also a second thing. We have a sort of institutionalized referral partners that we are trying to do a better and better job of matching with youth that need it. But then there's also sort of building the capacity of the village, of the community themselves. So as facilitators, we try to do our own through the life of a case, sort of organic service provision. So, okay, this is needed. We try to, if something comes up like a kid needs a mentor, we have mentoring programs. There's existing mentoring programs that we'll reach out to, but sometimes we'll just try to figure it out and ask, who are some of the other adults in your life that you trust? Can we invite them to the conference? Or have you done therapy before? And those sorts of things can often come up through our prep process as well. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach. I don't know if, LaShawna, I feel like I'm taking all these questions. You used to be a restorative justice facilitator, so you can answer some.
Go ahead. Okay, down here.
Zach, do you think that any part of you said earlier that you became a little complacent when you reached out? Do you think
Aaron.
Aaron, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Zach, do you think that any part of that had something to do with you wanting to meet with them and drop the charges?
I'd say it probably played a small role. I think in general there is an aspect to dealing with suspects where you start to care, you hopefully care about the outcome. And so initially, I had not even heard of restorative justice. So initially, I just wanted to meet him. I'm like, U.S. Attorney's Office, do what you will with the charges. There's a phrase that police talk about. We do our job. We don't worry what happens at court. Because court is very complex and there's a lot of different aspects that go into a legal case to make it successful. And sometimes officers, police officers on the street get discouraged because they're like, wait, I did everything I could. Why did it not work out? And so for my part, I can say thankfully, I believe, I've maintained my desire for positive outcomes with the people that I deal with.
I could understand why you did it. I was a police officer.
Okay, yeah, and so I'd like to think that I'm not in the least bit jaded, and I care very much about the people I deal with. And so initially, before I had even heard of restorative justice, I was like, I just want to know the person that did this and let him know what happened. I'm not an attorney. I don't necessarily want to be an attorney. So that, as far as the charges go, I wasn't particularly interested in how that aspect went.
Right, it's over, yeah.
Yeah, it's over. We did our part. What happened, happened. Let's take the next step. So that was my response.
I was wondering if that had something to do with it. And then, Roman, you said because it was a felony, you were a little hesitant. But then I don't know if you brought that part of the story into it at all. That he was a little complacent when he had arrested him.
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, what part?
You were talking about when you went to arrest him, I guess he pulled you, and that's when the bike went into your eye.
Yes, sir.
So that's when he would have been charged with a felony.
Correct.
Oh, right.
Yes, sir.
Correct.
Right. And then you have to bring it to Zach, and Zach makes the final decision.
Well, he's in Virginia, so we haven't had the pleasure of working with him. What?
The version of Zach.
Oh, I'm
yeah,
Aaron.
right. The version, exactly.
Yeah.
But you have to bring it to the
Attorney.
prosecutor there.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it was a discussion both with y'all's team and with the U.S. or was it U.S. Attorney's or Office of the Attorney General.
Yeah.
So everybody was involved in kind of the communication, trying to make sure that it'd be successful, or at least potentially successful. And as far as I think you keep talking about the complacency. I think that was
everybody.
it happens to everybody. I was going to just mention that. I think for me, which is possibly common among some victims, is you blame yourself, right? So in one sense, I never really, for the longest time, I didn't think of myself as a victim. Even, relatively recently when they asked me to come to this, we're like, oh, we'd love you to speak on the part of, being a victim. I was like, okay. But watching my own healing, watching my family's healing, I kind of embraced the fact that I was the victim of a crime in that sense. And obviously it's a more complex crime than usual, but thanks for asking, sir.
If that had something to do with it.
Thank you for asking.
For just one more question, this lady's.
I kind of following up. I just want to know, how did it get started? How were you able to even implement the restorative justice process to where you could even choose to do it? How you get Zach and them on board?
Years of visionary architecting from a couple people, but mostly Seema Gajwani, who's in the crowd right now, and who should be speaking up here instead of me, but she graciously let me speak up here. Our Attorney General Carl Racine, when he was first elected in 2014, one of his platforms was juvenile justice reform, and the way I understand it, I wasn't here yet. I was off in Oakland learning about restorative justice, and then came here because of this program. But basically, they took a look at what would it take to make this a reality. What are some of the different things that could really make a real impact on juvenile justice in DC? And restorative justice, I understand, Seema, was one of the things that you wanted to focus on, and she applied for a grant from the Department of Justice that initially allowed us to hire staff and train facilitators, again, relying on both regional and community existing restorative justice programs. I know Tarek's in the room. He was one of our trainers of our program early on. Thank you for that. We also partnered with a program in Baltimore that's been going for actually 20 years. So we cobbled together, training from people who've been doing the work, and we set out to first with not as necessarily as serious of cases, doing some cases in a pilot regard. I know Seema had actually sat in on some restorative justice circles and conferences that were happening in high schools in DC, including Ballou. So there were years of sort of observing restorative practices in other contexts before we launched the program here. And the fact that the Department of Justice was interested in giving a grant, it speaks to the fact that there is data coming out. There's independent research being done. There's studies coming out that suggest that the big thing that we're all looking for is a reduction in recidivism. So that's one of the easiest outcomes that will get funding. But from this conversation, you can probably see that there's so many benefits to restorative justice that are more than just recidivism reduction as well. But that was how the program started, and then we started getting good outcomes. The DC Council decided to provide more funding to fund now a team of 7 full-time restorative justice facilitators in our office, which is the most of any program like it of its kind in the country that's inside a justice department. So we're really, really excited about the success that we've had in the past 3 years.
We're out of time for questions up here, but we will all still be here for a few minutes. I know I saw a few more hands. If you guys want to approach us individually, we're happy to answer questions. If we could have a round of applause for our panelists. I think I speak for everyone. This was wonderfully insightful from all of you, so thank you for participating.
We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.